Hello and welcome to the History of Miami. This is part 2 in the series. My name is Mr. Cerrato, a U.S. history teacher from Miami Southridge Senior High. Now, in today's episode, what we'll be focusing on is the early half of Miami's development. The early 1900s, Miami grew from just a small vacation spot to a tropical paradise where thousands of Americans moved to unfortunately a place where people didn't really want to move to, and then following World War II, finally coming back to once again. In the first part of the series, what we discuss is what initially attracted people to Miami, going all the way back tens of thousands of years to just around the turn of the 20th century. As we begin, the city of Miami was founded in 1896. However, it will take another 10 years for the city of Miami to really expand. Beginning in 1906, a series of canals were dug all throughout the area of what we now know today as Miami-Dade County in order to create more land available for people to actually move and settle into the area. Prior to these canals being dug in 1906, Miami was just about 5 miles east of the Florida Everglades. So the Florida Everglades were dangerously close to the Atlantic Ocean in terms of being dangerous for human settlement. So in order to make more land available, these canals were dug, allowing the water to flow into the Atlantic Ocean and thus creating more land available further westward for people to move into the area. Following the end of World War I, people with a newfound sense of economic prosperity throughout the United States would make their attempts to turn paradise into a permanent destination. All throughout the state of Florida, thousands of people come down seeking their new way of life. So throughout the 1920s, at least until 1926, we have what is known as the Florida land boom, as people rush down, staking their claims to land and trying to create a new life. However, many of these individuals were also land speculators seeking to get in while the getting was good, so to speak. They would buy these lands very low and attempt to sell them at very high prices, thus turning a profit. Now, as for why Miami? Why would people come to live in Miami? Well, I'll give you 3 good guesses. The number one reason as to why people would move to Miami in the first place is simply the weather. The weather year-round, especially when compared to the balmy winters up north, seemed like a paradise, and as such, people desired to be away from the confines of being stuck in their homes during the winter, and South Florida, being a very hospitable place, becomes a natural destination for people to move down to. However, if you're thinking more along the vice side, you're absolutely right. Now, we know the 1920s as being the decade of prohibition, where alcohol was banned thanks to the passage of the Prohibition Amendment. However, in the state of Florida in particular, and especially within Miami, enforcement of prohibition was particularly lax. There were not a lot of controls going in, not a lot of police effort, not to mention the sheer amount of booze coming in from the Caribbean to then be outsourced to other locations within the United States. And as you might expect, along with booze, went with a very healthy side of gambling. So with perfect skies, cheap booze, and availability of gambling, Miami becomes a paradise to move to in the 1920s. However, and there is always a however, there is one thing that any person who has lived in Miami long enough can tell you. There is one thing that can destroy our tropical paradise, and it typically begins sometime around June 1st. Before we get to that one disastrous thing, we need to look at what goes on in South Florida that makes it so unappealing for some to actually live in this quote-unquote tropical paradise. Now, the first thing that people will tell you is just how expensive it is to live in Miami, how unaffordable housing is, how much it is that goods cost. And no, I'm not talking about 2020, I'm talking about 1926. Now, as many people had rushed in to buy land and began speculating on that land in hopes of turning a profit, well, that made it so that many people couldn't actually afford to live in South Florida. The cost of living became too much. Not to mention, The amount of goods being shipped into the area caused a backup of supplies, leading to an actual embargo of shipments to the South Florida area, with people unable to afford the housing, not to mention being able to afford to bring in goods to the area. It is not going to be affordable to live in the area of Miami. However, that will not be what signals its doom and its end of the boom. That will come in 1926, when a Category 4 hurricane will strike the greater Miami area. The Great Miami Hurricane, as it was known, struck the greater Miami area in 1926. When it arrived on shore, it was a Category 4 system, and in its wake left 373 people dead, with more than 25 to 50,000 estimated to be homeless. At the time, this is one of the greatest natural disasters that has ever struck the United States. And as you might imagine, if you were considering moving to the Miami area and just saw this system, well, you're not going to be that eager to move down here. And with the passage of the Great Miami Hurricane in 1926, it pretty much killed any hope of people moving down to South Florida. When combined with the other factors such as skyrocketing costs and Miami's unaffordable nature, people are simply not moving to the area. With 1926, that pretty much ended the land speculation boom within the entire state of Florida. And as such, even before the stock market crashed in 1929, we will see that even before the stock market crashes in 1929, Florida will enter into the Great Depression, with people losing their jobs, not to mention their homes and livelihood. It is going to be bleak in Miami for the next several years. As you might imagine, the Great Depression is not going to make things any easier for the citizens of Miami. Miami would have a problem with organized crime. Due to the lax enforcement of prohibition during the era, organized crime is going to run rampant through the area. While there won't be the massive shootouts that we see in other areas like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, Miami will still have its fair share of problems with organized crime. In 1933, Miami would make national headlines, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be delivering a speech in Bayfront Park. Unfortunately, there would be an assassination attempt on his life as he is giving the speech. An Italian anarchist by the name of Giuseppe Zagara would be the gunman. Unfortunately, he would strike in his attempt the mayor of Chicago dead, and as such, he would soon be executed. However, this attempted assassination on the American president, FDR, is not going to make Miami look great in the eyes of the nation. Albeit a bit more locally, things don't get that much better. Now, in 1937, there was a club known as La Paloma. Now, La Paloma was a LGBT club. It was a gay club in the 1930s. And largely it focused on drag shows and was an area where gay men and women could come together and congregate, albeit publicly but still secluded from the public. Unfortunately, this club would be discovered by the Ku Klux Klan, and in that year, 1937, the KKK would run a raid through the club. However, this would not damper the spirits of the LGBT community here in South Florida. Instead, it becomes a rallying point and becomes one of the first organized efforts to try and stand up for gay rights. So in the midst of the Great Depression and Miami's crumbling identity nationwide, there is some positive. And once we move out of World War II, just like the rest of the nation, Miami will be on its way back up and into prosperity. Just as with the rest of the United States, Miami is going to become a very important part in the war effort. With the beginning of World War II, even Miami was held under the subject of attacks. In 1942, a German U-boat sunk several vessels off the Florida coast, including several off the coast of Miami. What this then led to was the U.S. military establishing several outposts for Miami to serve as a location of defense. For example, Opelika Airport, as well as many other smaller regional airports, would be converted into air stations. That way they could provide defense, not to mention begin to train pilots. On the subject of training, more than 500,000 troops would come to Miami in efforts to train. Alongside them, 50,000 officers also made the voyage here. What this did was two things. One, it dramatically transformed Miami and its population, exposing it to a far wider national audience. After the war, many of these soldiers came to call Miami home, thus transforming Miami's population again. But also it had a community effect. New areas would become settled. For example, in southern Miami-Dade County, a largely unsettled area, a new air station would be created, the Richmond Naval Air Station, which today is the site of Zoo Miami. It was at this location where naval pilots were trained to fly blimps. In fact, if you look at the zoo, you can still see the tall towers where the blimps were held. However, with the creation of Richmond Naval Air Station, that then led to the creation of the neighborhood of Richmond Heights directly to its east. It is through this exposure, through all these troops coming into Miami, and once the war is done, they would soon come to resettle in Miami, in several new communities to house them. Because by 1950, Miami's population will be over 500,000 people. However, this will not be the greatest change that will occur in Miami's population. That will come at the end of the 1950s. The most transformational effect on the city of Miami and its surrounding communities doesn't happen in Miami, let alone the state of Florida or even the United States. It's the 1959 Cuban Revolution. In the aftermath of the revolution led by Fidel Castro in Cuba, thousands of Cubans decided to flee the island in the search of freedom. This exodus from Cuba would take multiple phases, multiple waves, but we're going to focus on the early ones that happened initially. One of the earliest operations that was conducted was known as Pedro Pan, or Peter Pan. As the name kind of gears towards, this operation involved children. From 1960 until 1962, 14,000 plus unaccompanied minors would be sent by their parents in Cuba to come and live in the United States. While the majority of them came to Miami, they would also be sent to Orlando, to New Jersey, New Mexico, and other points throughout the United States. These children came on their own. Children as young as 5 all the way to teenage youngsters. They would be sent here in the hope of freedom, that they would be able to escape the Castro regime. Now, many of these children were taken in by the Catholic Church within the United States, which itself had seen be kicked out of Cuba. However, as you might imagine, having children live on their own isn't the best idea, especially in orphanages and the like. So the next phase was bringing their parents here as well. And that would be conducted in what were known as the Freedom Flights. The Freedom Flights lasted from 1965 until 1973. And on these flights, emanating from Cuba and landing in Miami International Airport, more than 300,000 Cubans made their way here to the United States. Now, many of these individuals were professionals. These were people who were largely educated and had very much to lose from the communist system imposed by the Castro regime. As such, they sought their way to a new life, not to mention, for some, reuniting with their children. Now, when they arrived to the United States, many of them sought this as temporary, as they would soon go back once the Castro regime was deposed and defeated. Many stayed in housing that was located at the airport itself, whereas others attempted to come into American society. These individuals would be processed at the Freedom Tower, which is the large yellow tower that we see in downtown Miami, just down from the American Airlines Arena. Now, what happens here is that this immigration, this very large immigration, is going to have a transforming effect on Miami's community. What was once already 500,000 people is soon going to surge to 3/4, if not closer to 1 million people within the greater metropolitan area. And what we'll see is the beginning of the rising of divisions within Miami. For example, in the city of Miami, we have the neighborhood known as Little Havana, which was largely composed of Cuban refugees. Once they saw that life wasn't going to go back to the way that it was, they decided to stay. Now, for the early waves of Cuban immigrants, they were just merely allowed to come into the United States, and they were eventually expected to go back. However, following the Cuban Missile Crisis, we tend to realize that this is not going to come to a very easy, if not quick, end at all. As such, many of these Cuban refugees who had hoped to go back home are now dealing with the realization that the United States is now going to have to be their home. In 1966, the Cuban Adjustment Act will be passed, giving a way for permanent residency for many of these individuals. This will ultimately transform the city of Miami into the hub for the Cuban exile community. However, it is also going to massively grow the population within Miami, but also begin to sow divisions within it. Next time, we're going to discuss the Miami Vice era. We'll be talking about Miami's dramatic transformation as we move into the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So until next time, thank you for watching.